Maybe you heard a phrase that search engine clusters three things: documents, users, and queries.
Search engine can cluster three things. These are actual documents, users, and of course the queries.
I want to show you how to use these three things to build a proper topical map. We will start with some very basic and simple things, and then we'll get to the actual practical part. And so let's take an example of an affiliate website that promotes cameras, or we can also be a kind of website that sells a course for how to use the camera. The main and the most important thing is that we're focused on this central entity or this central object. You can throw this main term into any kind of research tools, and it will give you a data that looks something like this. All of these phrases, they will be string matching the target word, and some of these are quite useful, while others are not that much useful because they actually come from a different domain. And already over here you can realize a few problems. So first of all, there is a kind of dirty data that is involved that you cannot use because it is not applicable to you. So if we try to visualize the, let's say, completed topical map, let's imagine that this is going to be a kind of square that looks like this, and we need to process everything within the square. By doing this simple research, we're able to identify only a tiny fraction that will be, let's say, something like this. As you can see, this is really far from completing the actual topical map. However, in some scenarios, let's say specifically over here, if we're dealing with an affiliate site, it actually helps us to identify the central terms that we're trying to rank for. So obviously things like best cameras or best cameras for a specific purpose, this will be at the core section. This is something that we want to rank for. This is something that we're monetizing. So it is a useful step. You can spot some, let's say, applicable and practical things, but it is very far from the actual completed state, let's say. For the next step, let's imagine you processed your competitors and you learn that they have processed different models of cameras, or maybe they just talk about the brands. Maybe they talk about components or, let's say, parts or details of the camera itself. So this now allows you to deepen this processing. There's only one small issue with that. This depends on the, let's say, level, skill set, and knowledge of your competitors. It is a real case that in some scenarios, the competition doesn't know what to do either, and they're just sort of copying each other by leaving a ton of gaps. But let's just say for this case, they did a pretty good job, which then should look something like this. Over here we still have the core part that we took from queries, and from competition we also found additional things to cover. So we definitely have improved the coverage overall, but it's still far from being completed. This leaves us with the last part, which are the users over here. One important detail that we mentioned at the beginning of the video is that this is related to clustering. I think everybody in the industry understands how the queries are being clustered and also how the documents are being clustered. But how does it actually happen when it comes to users? To answer this topic, I actually want to show you this screenshot from a movie called The Social Dilemma. If you haven't seen that movie, I really recommend you to watch. The point is that it shows you a very good visual example for how a profile of a person is being developed over time as they use social media. Essentially, over here you can see a kind of avatar that does not have any specific characteristics. We don't know the gender, the age, or kind of any points of interest or any kind of emotional triggers. As the user goes through content and gives kind of responses and signals and feedback, it turns into something like this over time. So this is the same avatar or the same profile, except that now it looks basically like a copy of the actual main character of that movie. And over here you can see different pieces of contents that can trigger emotions or sort of, let's say, incentivize certain behaviors within this user. This is really important to understand because basically Google has a very similar technology for understanding users, or some people might even say it's an exact copy in a way. Basically, if you go to, let's say, Topics API in Google's documentation, you can see a kind of sample idea of how it's being done. Over here, there are different topic names. So things like pets, cats, let's say indie music. Once they're able to identify a topic or an interest for one specific user, then they can identify the same one for another user. And based on these things, these kinds of, let's say, clusterings or groupings, they can occur. This is just a demo representation of this API. It's very limited in what kind of amount of topics and how granular they're able to show them to you. This is just a kind of interface for developers for this thing. Unfortunately, this API is being deprecated since October of this year. Before the deprecation, you could visit this thing directly through Chrome, and it will show you your, let's say, interests or topics, and it will give you an actual real report on based on your behaviors. You can still check it out, for example, the classifier thing over here, but this is basically the main general idea. There is a way for them to understand your behavior on things like these, or in real case, something that Google would be using on their backend. It can include lots of things like YouTube searches and behaviors. It could be your, let's say, Pixel device, emails, and lots of other things. Okay, so how do we actually use this part to complete the topical map? The natural process is obvious. The user sends the query to get the document. In reality, if we take a slightly deeper look at this process, first there is a thought, then user goes to the Google's interface, and then they send the query, and then they get the document. Now, at this point, to some people, this might start to sound like white hat bullshit. First, I have to explain to you the fundamental principles of how these things work. Once you understand them well, you can start coming up with shortcuts, different tricks, and different other things. But for now, we just have to stick to the basics. So, there's a thought, then the user, then the query. Now let's just simplify this to make it, let's say, extra simple or extra clear. Let's just say there's a thought, then there is, let's say, a dude or a guy who then has a question, and then they're actually looking for the answer. This is a, let's say, primitive or a simplified version. However, this part over here is really important because a big search engine or a big commercial search engine like Google is actually a question answering system. So try to keep this in mind. Now let's take even closer look at what's happening over here at this level. So first, let's make our user. And one of the most important parts basically happen over here. For example, it can be something like this. You have lots of different, let's say, contexts over here. There's a real desire and a real, let's say, requirement. Basically, it's a real life situation that this person is in right now. And then the user sends the query, which is going to look something like this. Basically, this phrase over here becomes an abrupt version, a very shortened version in comparison to this thought over here. Lots of, let's say, intents and context all of a sudden are being lost, which is why search engines have a kind of query processing mechanism, or let's say a query expansion, where they try to reverse engineer or basically predict what does this query actually mean and what are the possible, let's say, contexts and angles and different intents that are happening based on this query over here. The most important part is that there's lots of these different technologies that exist, and basically none of them are really that much accurate, because at the end, all of them are being verified through the actual user behavior. Once they're being presented within the SERPs to the users, the system tracks how does the actual human respond to this type of interpretation. And if it's a valid one, then they start to use it. And if it's an invalid one, then of course they move on. the most important part is that the people understand people. Machines do not really understand, and they have a hard time interpreting these things. This is exactly where an SEO can have a very good skill set to try to basically read the mind of a person by trying to capture this type of, let's say, interpretation based on these mini representations of the thoughts. This is especially useful in a scenario when you're dealing with queries and you're building briefs, or let's say designing a kind of HTML layout for your pages. As long as you're able to spot hidden, let's say, contexts or intents behind these things, it can greatly help you to design better documents overall. Now, how do we actually use these things to build the topical map? This leads us to the next concept over here, which is about the actual structure of the search engine, or specifically, let's say, the things that it is oriented on, which is this part over here. The search engine runs essentially on entities. We can represent it as a kind of, let's say, object like this. They can kind of walk from one thing to another one by just looking at the different connections that can be appearing from one object to another one. And essentially there are 4 connections that can exist. It will look something like this. Let's say you have the central object that you're focusing on. And then there is a parent and child relationships, which are these ones over here. And then there is the siblings that are appearing on, let's say, the equal level over here. As long as you're focused on one specific entity at a time, you're actually able to walk the chain of connections exactly the same way that the search engine would do that. So if we're going to imagine a more practical application, how do we actually complete this part over here? You can basically put yourself into a position of a user that will just go and ask questions. Let's say you're dealing with something unknown, like, let's say, a concept of anthropology. If you don't know what this is, you can just simply take this thing as your central entity, as your central focus. Then go to search engine and start to imitate the user's behavior. And if you don't know anything about the niche, it's actually a good thing, because probably your first question will be something like, what is this thing? Once you send the query, you can analyze the SERPs, its features, and spot what are other entities that start to appear over there. You can also spot these kinds of things in query suggestions, where this starts to signal basically a sibling relationships between entities of the same class or the same type. And this way, you can basically take one of these things, ask lots of questions around it, understand how this connects to the next part, and process it further just by querying the search engine and evaluating the SERPs. This is exactly why I showed this during the Warsaw's presentation. Now you can see a very direct and clear connection between, let's say, connecting the dots in this way and actually following this principle of moving, let's say, upwards, downwards, and then left and right. Completing this step actually allows you to finalize and sort of prepare a full coverage for the topical map. It's exactly the kind of manual procedure and a walkthrough by all of the entities and their relations. You're able to basically spot all kinds of micro details that might have been lost within the first 2 steps. One important nuance though, this right here is not a completed topical map. This technically is just a concept map. We have gathered all concepts that have to be processed, but now we need to align them with Google's logic and, let's say, Google's understanding of things. And this is quite simple to this kind of, let's say, meme or situation over here. Basically, imagine that Google has prepared indices for every single entity or, let's say, query template or entity attribute pair. And your job is to shape that concept map to fit into these specific components over here, or these specific indices that have been prepared for you. And so the final version will look something like this. Basically, you took these concepts, you combined them, or you reshaped them in order to position them exactly within the indices that Google has preset. This type of structure is now aligned exactly within the Google's server structure, which makes it processing this type of website much cheaper, which gives you a massive competitive edge. And so this over here is the actual proper topical map that you can use, that you can work with. But the fun part, you can actually take these things even slightly further. Now imagine this scenario. These different colors represent different competitors. So you can see the red one basically is the most dominant one with the biggest coverage. You can do a kind of competitive analysis and evaluation to understand what's the actual competitive score, let's say, for all of these sources and how easy it is to outrank them. You can rely on things like these in order to understand the actual, let's say, competitive levels for all of these sources. And let's say you have identified that this competitor is the weakest one, and out of their coverage, this specific index is the easiest one to go and compete with them. So you go and do that. Once you gain success over here, this now allows you to basically expand into additional sections and process them as well. As you do that, you actually outrank your first competitor entirely. Once you have done that, now it allows you much easier to go for the next biggest competitor, which is this one over here. Once you outrank the second guy, you gain much more mass, and now it allows you to compete with the next guy over here. Once you have outcompeted all of these micro competitors, now you have enough mass to actually go for the main biggest competitor, which is the representative of this whole cluster. So this is the main working principle behind this topical map, and you can realize that it's in a way kind of like a board game or like a video game, because there's an actual, let's say, prioritization or a sequencing that is involved. Of course, you can just process the topical map sort of blindly, but these types of prioritizations, they allow you to be much more efficient and much more, let's say, economical to get better results, and also in a quicker way. And finally, I want to show one of the, let's say, alternative analogies for how to think about this topical map. So as you understand, in some approaches, you start to build the topical map from the core part or from the, let's say, central part. Once that is completed, then you actually go for, let's say, the outer layers, or you just go further out into the other topics to expand your coverage and process, let's say, other additional things. And then once that is done, you keep going further out, and this is the kind of situation that you're shaping in a way. So at the center, we have the main component and then additional layers that allow us to, let's say, process things additionally. If you imagine this to be a kind of 3D object, and then we tilt it, it will look something like this. So you can realize now that we're actually building a funnel. Over here, you have the most important audience, the one that will be monetized. And this is essentially, in most cases, comes from queries. That's what everybody knows. These are the direct buyers. But over here, you have, let's say, kind of hot leads. Over here could be cold leads. Over here could be just potentially interested people that might convert in like a few months. And so the point is that you capture your audience across all types of life scenarios or all types of search behaviors, as long as it leads them down the funnel and brings actually to your final landing page where you monetize your service or your product. And finally, I want to mention that there is no right or wrong way to, let's say, start the process or finish the process, because some people prefer to start, let's say, from the central part. Some people prefer to go from the outer sections and then sort of complete everything step by step from the outside towards inside. Some people prefer to map out the whole actual, let's say, boundaries or of where everything is happening, and then start to do the processing. All of these, let's say, solutions or approaches are valid. It's much more about understanding these principles behind the proper topical map, but the approach that you decide to take later on, this is totally up to you, your preference. As long as you follow these main rules, then everything will work out in the way that it should. And that's it for this video. I hope you learned something new, and thank you for watching.